the origin of this talk is I hang out with a lot of people from like the effective altruism community who are interested in AI, people who are very worried about AI bringing about the end of the world. And a lot of those people I find are in the grips of a particular kind of moral theory, which I don't agree with. And within philosophy, I think there are a lot of people who don't share that moral theory, but they're often not interested in the same kinds of issues regarding AI. They're interested in things like algorithmic bias and things like that. And so what I want to do is talk about a sort of very, I think, basic distinction, early choice point that you might have when you choose what moral theory you like, and how some of the issues around AI would look different if you choose the view that I like rather than this other kind of view. Originally, I had this called person affecting ethics. I changed it to personalist ethics because I didn't want people complaining that I don't use person affecting the way that Derek Parfit defined it or anything like that. So, so just to make things more complicated for everybody, I've introduced a new term, and it's probably already used for something else, but I don't care. It's my talk. Okay. So the plan is I'm going to describe two general moral pictures, frameworks. Then I'm going to talk about some motivations for the one that I like, which I'm going to call personalism. And then I'm going to go through a bunch of what I take to be some implications of that view, or at least the most plausible ways of developing that view. First, I'm going to talk about some of the implications for things like how we should care about the apocalypse, inevitable AI apocalypse, or maybe not so inevitable, how we should think about the potential benefits of an AI utopia in the future, and in general, the costs and benefits of AI to us. And then I want to talk about some of the implications for how we ought to treat AI. Okay, so I think there are differences between the way personalism and the way impersonalism, or at least the main versions of impersonalism, are going to think about how we treat AI. Some of the things that I'm going to say are not going to be very surprising if you've done a lot of population ethics, but maybe we can have more interesting conversations in the Q&A if you're already very up to date on that sort of stuff. Okay. So here are two slogans about morality, you might think. One is morality, okay, it's about making the world a better place. That's what you're supposed to do. I'm going to call that the impersonalist slogan. On some definitions, that's also called consequentialism. And so it recommends actions in virtue of their sort of moral relationship to the world itself. The world can be better or worse, and then what you ought to do is make the world better rather than worse. Probably the most prominent view of this kind, and the view that's going to be my sort of foil for the purposes of this talk, is total utilitarianism, which has a view about what makes the world better or worse, namely, the world is better when it has more total pleasure or happiness in it, and it's worse when it has less. The second slogan, the one that I like, the personalist slogan, says you shouldn't mistreat people or wrong them. Shouldn't do things against which people have complaints or objections or something of that kind of sort. I call that the personalist slogan. Again, I don't know if everybody, this is my terminology for it, since it recommends actions in virtue of the action's moral relationship to individual persons, not to the impersonal value of the world. And I expect that both of these slogans have at least some initial plausibility. And I should say that they're not, like, strictly speaking, inconsistent. You could think morality is about both of these things. You should make the world a better place, and also you shouldn't mistreat people. Especially if you're kind of pluralist sympathies, then you might think, okay, morality is about all kinds of stuff. It's also not an exhaustive list. So for instance, if you're a virtue ethicist, that's not really well represented in that kind of binary. But I'm going to think about these two views mainly as though they were competing views, how to think about the relevance of welfare or well-being. Now, on a lot of moral issues, I think the differences between the personalist and impersonalist way of thinking about things is not going to matter that much in the end. So suppose there's some policy and it makes a bunch of people suffer and doesn't have very many good effects on anybody. I think both the personalist and the impersonalist are going to think that that's a bad policy, that's wrong to implement that policy. They're going to give different explanations in terms of welfare. So the impersonalist might say something like, well, if you implement this policy, there's going to be less well-being in the world's going to be worse. You don't want to make the world worse, so you shouldn't do it. The personalist is going to say something like, well, the people that are worse off, mistreating them by implementing this policy. And so, yeah, the policy is wrong for that reason. But they're going to agree that the policy is wrong. But I don't think these types of views will agree, at least the most plausible versions of them are going to agree about all kinds of cases. And in particular, I think artificial intelligence is one of the rare areas where there's a lot of disagreement or a lot of difference in what these types of views will recommend for, I think, basically two reasons. One is that decisions about AI have like a lot of their important implications have to do with the future, the distant future, future generations. And two, when it comes to AI agents, we're not just affecting beings that already exist. We are creating new beings. And I think situations where you're creating new beings are one of the kinds of situations where these two types of views have quite different implications. Okay. It's not my main aim to argue for personalism, but since I'm going to be trying to draw out some surprising and maybe like absurd implications of the view, even though I like it, it's probably worth just saying why you might be attracted to the view. One reason you might just find the core idea appealing. So if you think morality is about what we owe each other, then the personalist slogan is going to sound better to you than the impersonalist one, because it has to do with, like this kind of interpersonal obligations, whereas that doesn't naturally fit with the impersonalist idea, where it's about making the world a better place. That's just kind of baseline plausibility thing. And then there are certain things that I think the personalist is in a better position to explain. Now, the personalism and impersonalism are kind of templates for views. You have to like plug in a lot of stuff before they have a lot of implications. But in general, I think the personalist is in a better position to explain the permissibility of self-sacrifice. So here again, I'm going to contrast it with total utilitarianism, which is not the only impersonalist view, but just to give you a flavor of why it's why that kind of view might struggle. So we generally think that, at least I think that it's okay for me to make a large sacrifice in my own well-being in order to benefit somebody else by a smaller amount. It's at least permissible, and it might even be kind of heroic of me if I make a huge sacrifice to help one of you. Maybe I have a cookie and I love cookies so much, and you only kind of like cookies, but I give you the cookie. I sacrifice the enjoyment to me, give it to you. That seems okay. But if you're explaining what I ought to do in terms of what makes the world better or worse, it's a little bit hard to explain why that would be okay. Isn't the world better when I eat the cookie, given that I enjoy it more? And so why would it be okay for me to eat the cookie myself, or sorry, for me to give you the cookie when I could just eat it myself and make the world better? Whereas the personalist has kind of an easy explanation that it might be something like, well, you can't wrong yourself. That's why it's okay, because you don't have obligations to yourself, or at least if you have such obligations, you're always free to kind of withdraw your complaints against your own actions. Another motivation is, I think the personalist is in a better position to explain what are sometimes called agent-centered reasons. So, for example, I have a reason to keep my promises if I make them. And it seems like my reason to keep my promises can't just be explained by the fact that like the world is better if I keep my promises. Because if the explanation was that the world is better if I keep my promises, well then if I could break my promise and make two other people keep their promises, then that would make the world even better, right? But that's not what my reason to keep my promises is like. It's not just a reason to make sure promises in the world are kept. It's a reason for me to keep my promises. And so again, that's something which, if you're explaining things in terms of how good the world is, you have a hard time. I won't talk about this very much, even though related issues are going to come up in the talk. But if you are familiar with population ethics, views like total utilitarianism run into certain counterexamples, most famous of which is the repugnant conclusion. So very quickly, many of you already know, but since total utilitarianism says you ought to maximize the total amount of well-being in the world, it says that you ought to bring about a world in which there's like tons of beings that have a very small amount of happiness, as long as the total is very, very large, rather than a world in which there's a smaller number of people with a much higher degree of happiness. I think the personalist is in a better position to avoid that problem and certain other kinds of counterexamples that Derek Parfit and others have come up with. Impersonalist views, in particular, again, total utilitarianism, are often or sometimes accused of not respecting what's called the separateness of persons, which is sort of I think, a vague complaint, but the idea is that they don't really, because they only care, the utilitarian only cares about the amount of happiness in the world, they don't particularly care about the boundary between individual people. They just think that everyone's just a receptacle for pleasure and pain, and you can sort of, you can replace one person with another person. That's sort of the way in which the distribution goes is completely insignificant. The boundaries between people are not respected. This is sort of a fuzzy, I think, complaint, but arguably personalist views, because they're so focused on the person as like a sort of important moral unit, they're in a better position to respond to this kind of concern. And then finally, this is also related to population ethics. The personalist is in a better position to explain an intuition a lot of people have, which is called the intuition of neutrality, namely that it doesn't seem obligatory to bring new people into the world. Like having a child, we generally think is permissible, but not obligatory, even if your child would be happy. Right? It's my child, I'm sure it would be happy if I had them, but I'm not acting wrongly by not bringing them into the world. But if you're an impersonalist, that's actually not easy to explain. Wouldn't the world be better if my child was in it? If there would be more happiness in the world? In fact, according to utilitarianism, like not bringing my child into the world is not just bad, but it seems like it's as bad as killing somebody, killing a baby. And it doesn't seem to me like not having a kid is as bad as killing a baby. I don't know. Maybe you agree with that. So those are all reasons why you might be a personalist. They're maybe not the only reasons, but they tend to motivate me. Now I'm going to make an assumption. Well, I'm going to be focusing on welfare. Personalists and impersonalists, they don't have to focus only on welfare. So impersonalists care about what makes the world better or worse. And certain impersonalist views might think that there's things other than well-being that make the world better or worse, like how much beauty there is in it. The personalists, they think, there's ways you can wrong other people, and some of the ways don't have to do with welfare. They might just have to do with keeping your promises or not lying to people. I'm not going to talk about those kinds of reasons. I'm focusing on reasons which come from the well-being of other people. And then I'm going to make an assumption about how the personalist view should think about the moral reasons that come from well-being. I think this assumption is plausible, but it's not completely uncontroversial. So we can talk about in Q&A maybe about what ways you could reject this. I'll call it the comparative assumption. And the assumption, this is just a necessary condition, is that an action wrongs a subject with respect to welfare only if there's some other action which would have made the subject better off. Or if it gives the subject a life, which is in some absolute sense bad. So the idea is maybe if I create somebody, bring someone into existence, and their life is worse than nothing, then maybe that's a way in which I can wrong them. But the only other way I can wrong them is by making them worse off than they would have been if I had done something else, at least wrong them with respect to welfare. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about AI. So AI has the potential for tremendous effects. We've talked about that throughout this conference, both positive and negative on human welfare, both on present generations and future generations. How do we balance the risks? Well, what I'm going to say is, in short, that if personalism is true, then effects on future generations of AI, just like don't really matter. They're morally irrelevant. So let me just say, I'll give a more general argument a little bit later, but just to get the gist of why that is. So first of all, I'll come up with about 6 implications, I think, in this talk. The first one is that AI apocalypse is not as bad if you're a personalist as if you're an impersonalist. Lots of people, including me, are worried about AI as an existential threat, perhaps the only realistic, truly existential threat. A lot of people, I think, I'm pretty convinced that even if there was a nuclear war, that people would survive. Even if there was a pandemic, there would be some people around afterwards. But it's at least plausible that something like AI could completely wipe us out. And a lot of people think that this threat might be significant enough to warrant pausing or maybe even shutting down AI development, or at least doing some pretty extreme things in order to prevent it. How strong are our reasons to prevent AI from killing us? According to our representative and personal view, the reasons are really, really, really strong, right? Because, well, first of all, it's bad if, it's like all of our happiness, us in this room and on Earth, like we would lose out on the future happiness of our lives if the world were to end because I'm assuming some like if the AI itself was really happy, that might change things. But suppose the AI isn't super happy, it's just killing us all. Well, our happiness gets lost from the value of the world, but also all of the human generations that would have existed after us, their happiness is also lost to the world. And their happiness is also important on the impersonalist view. So we have to include the value of all of those people, their lives. at least on sort of utilitarianism, this particular impersonalist view. But on the personalist view, the reason is much weaker. The future generations who never get to be born, they can't be wronged by our decision. Why is that? Well, because you can't be wronged unless you exist at some time. You don't necessarily have to exist now to be wronged, but if you never exist, you can't be wrong. That's the assumption I'm making. And so the sort of the loss of the welfare of all those future people doesn't really matter, morally speaking, because that loss of welfare is not that anybody is suffering. So if we assume, as I think is plausible, the strength of a reason is proportional to its effect on sort of morally relevant welfare, the reason to prevent extinction is only like a fraction as strong on the personalist view than on the impersonalist view, because there are going to be many, many, many generations, or there might be many, many, many generations of people after us. The number of those potential future people is going to be much greater than the current population of the Earth, and so if only the loss of our welfare counts, as I think it does on the personal view, then the reason is, yeah, much, much weaker. When I was talking to John Hawthorne earlier, he pointed out to me that I guess a lot of metaphysicians nowadays like a view called necessitism, on which all possible beings exist necessarily. So all those people who don't get to, don't get to quote unquote exist because of AI in the future, John was suggesting, well, maybe they do exist. They're just not concrete. So maybe that opens the door to saying that actually we do wrong those people. They're just not concrete people. I've only had like an afternoon to think about it, but I think it's also plausible that you can't wrong people who are not concrete. So we can just sort of translate what I wanted to say about existing people, just talk about concrete people. In any case, I think if you deny that, if you think you can wrong sort of non-concrete people by preventing them from existing, then you're gonna run into problems with the intuition of neutrality, which we saw was one of the motivations for being a personalist. You're gonna end up saying that, well, when I don't have the kid, then I wrong that sort of non-concrete but existing person, which could have existed if I had the kid. Okay. So you might think, okay, so AI apocalypse is not that bad on the personalist view, but AI has all these great benefits, and so surely the reasons are going to be super strong in favor of like accelerating AI. Also not so obvious, because I think on the personalist view, the utopia, the positive benefits of AI are also not that significant morally. The reason for that is not as you might think, because the people in the future don't exist yet. Like, I think whenever I talk to people and present this view, that's always the first thing they assume is that, oh, the reason is those people don't exist. You can't wrong people who don't exist. Therefore, you can't wrong future people. That's actually not the reason that I want to appeal to. You could have that view, but I don't want to have that view. I think you could. I want to leave open that you can wrong people who don't exist yet. So the only thing I want to assume is you can't wrong people who never exist, but you can wrong people who don't exist yet. You can wrong people who existed in the past. I think both of those I want to at least leave open. So why is it that I'm saying that the future benefits of AI are not that significant? Well, it's because of the phenomenon that goes by the non-identity problem. So the idea is, suppose we have these two choices. This is like a simple choice. Suppose if we make AI, there's going to, in 100 years, there's going to be this population of like super happy people living in a techno utopia. And if we don't make AI, then we're we're like cave people in 100 years, like we are now. Um, you might, on the impersonalist view, obviously, like the first world seems better than the second world, and so we have really strong reason to bring it about. But on the personalist view, I don't think that's the case. And the reason is that the people who exist in that first future, the techno-utopia, are not the same people as the ones who exist in sort of the boring caveman alternative. The reason they're not the same people is just any significant change, like creating AI, will alter the conditions under which people have children. They're going to have sex at slightly later or slightly earlier times. Different sperms and different eggs are going to come together. And so the actual identity of the people who are going to exist in both of those scenarios are going to be, so they're just a completely disjoint set of people who are going to exist in 100 years, or if not 100 years, then 150 or 200 years. And why does that matter if you're a personalist? Well, because, so look at the people in population B. They are living their caveman lives, but their lives, I'm assuming, are still positive overall. Their lives are worth living for them. If you ask them, like, would you rather never have existed? They wouldn't say they would rather never have existed. So their lives are fine for them. They're not as good lives as the people in the techno-utopia. But there's nothing that we could have done that would have let those people exist and had a better life. So there's no action available to us that would allow the people who are in the caveman future to live a better life. The only thing we could is prevent them from existing and create a different group of people. And if we're in that kind of situation, based on the assumption that I made earlier about welfare, there's no sense in which we wrong them with respect to welfare. So we create caveman people. As long as their lives are worth living, we do not wrong them, given that we couldn't have done anything to make them better off. Now, some of you might recognize this as a very famous implication of certain views. Originally, Derek Parfit presented this type of case and a sort of smaller, more cozy text as an objection to the type of view that I'm defending. Not really defending, but the type of view under discussion. It's supposed to be a counterexample, so you might think, well, haven't I just refuted the personalist view? I mean, it depends. I'll leave it open to you to what you think about this kind of case. But I think many personalists nowadays think that the best view in the personalist camp is going to accept a counterintuitive verdict in the non-identity problem, and they think it's not so bad. Or at least that the alternatives are worse. I mean, to sort of adjudicate whether the alternatives are worse and what all the other options are would be asked for another time. But one of the worries is that the ways to avoid this implication, that it's okay, in this case, you have a less happy child and a happier child. The way to avoid the implication that it's okay to have the less happy child would take on worse commitments, more counterintuitive implications. It might commit you to the repugnant conclusion or other kinds of undesirable implications for population ethics. So yeah, I mean, that's just a long way of saying I think you should just bite the bullet on the non-identity problem if you're a personalist. At least I'm sort of going to be assuming that. Okay, so the third implication, we've got that the apocalypse wouldn't be so bad, utopia wouldn't be that great. Third is that if there's an apocalypse but it's delayed, then that's actually totally fine. Again, you can have it's for the exact same reason as the previous case. So suppose we make AI and there's going to be a Terminator apocalypse, but it's going to be in like 150 years. Okay. Or we could not make AI or make some other kinds of choice. It's just one very simple choice we could make. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be found in 150 years, not living maybe a utopia life, but reasonably happy lives. Why is it fine to make the AI? Well, because again, the people who live in the population A are not the same people as in population B. And even though the people in population A, they all get wiped out by the Terminators, like before they got wiped out by the Terminators, they all got to have childhoods and stuff. And so their lives overall, I'm assuming, might still be worth living. And so we don't wrong them by making AI, because our only alternative, we couldn't have created them and not had the Terminators kill them. The only thing we could have done is created some other group of people that wasn't killed by the Terminators. So, I mean, this relates to some of the talks we had earlier in this conference. So, in John Hawthorne's talk and Herman's talk, we considered whether there was any reason to delay the sort of inevitable fall of like AI apocalyptic consequences. And the claim here is that on personalism, there is a reason for us to delay it. So if we can delay it long enough that the people who experience the fall are some of these future generations, then it's actually totally fine, morally speaking. It'd be much better morally than if any of us were to experience the apocalypse. And again, not because we matter more, but just because there's nothing we can do for those people, right? Except prevent them from existing. So it doesn't sound, it's less callous, I think, than it sounds. Okay. Sometimes when I present this to people who are worried about AI, they say, well, maybe you're right, but like it's still so bad. The risk is so high that that our generation gets killed by AI, and there's so many people, a lot of people in our generation already, and the risk of AI is pretty substantial. And so I think they sometimes respond by saying, well, it kind of doesn't matter which view is true. We're going to have like overwhelming reason to do everything possible to prevent the AI apocalypse. Whichever view you accept. Is that true? Well, it'll depend on the numbers, and I don't have a super strong view one way or another, but just some like quick math on a napkin. So if we suppose that humanity would survive, let's say for an expected 100,000 years, if AI doesn't kill us in our lifetime, if you assume that the risk of AI killing us in our lifetimes is like about 1%, so there's like a recent survey where AI experts said the risk of that was about 3%. There's some non-expert super forecasters who are very good at predicting things in general. They thought it was 0.34%. So let's like round it off to about 1%. And suppose we have like a policy, maybe it's like an AI pause, maybe it's something else, which has an opportunity cost of like 10% of US GDP, and it lowers the risk of AI apocalypse in the next lifetimes by 10%. I don't know if those numbers are obviously like pulled out of one of my dark crevices, but yeah, at least they seem like not insane as like a type of decision we might face. How does the math work out? Well, if you try and calculate, okay, how much does it cost per life saved? Which again might not be the best way to calculate this. But if we only count the current population, then we're basically saving morally relevant lives at like $250,000 a life. If we are counting the future population, then we're saving morally relevant lives by about $250 per life. And by comparison, let's say some effective charities like that are recommended by GiveWell have an efficiency of about $5,000 per life saved. So that's just to say that there are some numbers which seem like not insane that you could plug in where it makes a difference which of these moral theories you accept. Okay, where if you were in this case accepting the impersonalist view and buying this kind of calculation, then you would think, well, it's more efficient to saving these lives is very efficient. More efficient than, let's say, giving money to GiveWell. Whereas if you had a personalist view, you might think it's less efficient. Anyway, don't take this math too seriously. Okay. Oops. So just a quick summary of the argument. So the idea, whatever we do with respect to AI, people in future generations will not be worse off than they would have been if we had acted otherwise. Whatever we do with respect to AI, people in future generations will have lives that are worth living. If those two things, then our decisions regarding AI, people in future generations, that's based on a principle that we talked about earlier. If personalism is true, and our decisions regarding AI do not wrong people, then we don't need to be concerned with the effects of AI on future generations. Sorry, I guess that's more of what relies on the principle earlier. And so the conclusion, if personalism is true, then we need to be concerned with the effects of AI on future generations. Now, this argument is just a little bit too quick, so I think almost all these premises have plausible challenges. So we can talk about those in Q&A. I want to get through some other stuff. But yeah, even I don't accept all of these premises. But this is kind of the rough sketch of the argument. And we can get into the details about ways you could reject one or more of these premises. Let me just, okay. So that's just how we should think about kind of the risk of AI apocalypse and the benefits of AI utopia if we're personalists. Now I want to talk about our obligations to AI. So suppose we can create AI agents that have whatever it takes to be morally relevant. What are we obligated to do for that? So I think personalist and impersonalist views should agree on certain things, like you shouldn't cause them unnecessary suffering and that sort of thing. But I think personalist views might have quite different implications for whether and how we should create these kinds of agents. So on an impersonal view, like in particular like on total utilitarianism, if we can create AI that have like very high levels of well-being, then we have a really strong moral reason to do that. And in fact, if we can efficiently translate resources into welfare in that form, then we're obligated to do so, even at significant cost to human welfare. So one of my colleagues, Nielsen Ababu, who's a utilitarian, his dream is that we like tile the universe with like little robots that do nothing but experience pleasure all the time. And so he thinks that's great. On the personalist view, I think we don't have that kind of obligation. For the very same reasons we don't care about human extinction, nobody's wronged by the decision not to create these happy little robots. Okay, that's not too surprising given what we talked about before. The remaining implications I want to talk about have to do with the theme that you might think, you might call identity matters on the personalist view. So when it comes to your moral reason to provide given benefits, the facts about which beings are identical to which beings makes a big difference on the personalist view in a way it doesn't on a view like utilitarianism. And in particular, both cross-temporal, sort of identity over time, and cross-worlds, like who's identical in one possible world relative to another. both of those facts matter. So let me talk about the cross-temporal case first. So imagine there's an AI agent, we'll call it Earl, and we can modify it in some way. So we can, let's say, I don't know, change some weights in its neural network or change its software entirely. I don't know. There's lots of, I'm not an AI scientist, so I don't know what we do to AIs, but suppose that there's something we can do to it. Okay, I don't know, put a floppy disk in and switch it out. And suppose that results in an AI agent. We'll call that agent Laddie, and that agent will be much happier than Earl would have been without the modification. Is there any moral problem with doing that, like upgrading Earl? On many impersonal views, not necessarily all, but at least on utilitarianism, there's not going to be any problem. The world is going to be better if you upgrade. And so you want to do it. But on a personalist view, whether there's a moral problem, whether you ought to upgrade Earl or not, could depend on a metaphysical question. Are Earl and Laddie the same person, or are they different people? Why does that matter? Well, if Earl and Laddie, so Earl is the early agent, Laddie is the later one, if they're the same agent, then you're just benefiting Earl by making the modification. Now, there might be some non-welfarist problem with modifying somebody without their consent, but setting that aside, Earl doesn't have any kind of objection on the grounds of Earl's welfare for you doing that. And in fact, failing to modify Earl would be depriving him of some benefit. And so that is plausibly wrong, or at least is a kind of wrong-making feature. But if Earl and Laddie are different agents, then things are different. Modification would be ending Earl's existence and replacing them with a different agent, Laddie. That would be bad for Earl. Assuming their unmodified future would still be worthwhile. And it would be good for somebody who, like we already discussed, you don't have any reason to create. You don't have any positive reason to bring about new happy agents. But it looks like you do have some reasons not to create or not to harm existing agents on the personalist view. And so that looks at least like morally problematic. Okay. I don't totally agree with what I just said, but I'm going to skip past it for purposes of time. Okay. So on the personalist view, in contrast to I think the most common impersonalist view, is we got to be worried about whether changes that we make to AI are identity affecting changes or not identity affecting changes. So modifications, if a modification would be identity altering, that might make it wrong instead of permissible. And if it wouldn't be identity altering, that might make it obligatory rather than permissible. So that includes things like upgrading an AI or transferring an AI from one physical body to another. I'm not going to try and tackle the question of when AI are or not identical over time. Not a metaphysician. But there might be some surprising results if we like import some of the things a lot of people think about human personal identity into that kind of context. So, for example, it seems plausible to a lot of people that we can survive. Like if I slowly, change my psychology and eventually become like a very different kind of person. A lot of people think as long as that happens in a gradual sort of way, maybe I've been sort of, I spent too much time on the internet, and then 5 years later, I become some awful fascist. Okay, that's still me, the awful fascist. In the future, maybe that person doesn't care about the same sort of things I care about now, but it's still me. Whereas if, let's say, you just immediately warped my brain, so I instantly, all of my beliefs, all of my desires just flipped to be the opposite of what they are now, then I would cease to exist and a different person would replace me instead. And so that's a case of like a discontinuous change. In that case, I don't survive. That's what intuition a lot of people have. If you would just apply that to AI, that might mean that it sort of matters whether you upgrade an AI in a kind of slow, gradual way or in a kind of immediate, jumpy, discontinuous way. That could matter for what you're allowed to do to the AI, which I think is a strange thought. Okay. Finally, identity also matters across worlds. So cross-temporal identity matters for how we treat agents, AI agents who already exist. Cross-world identity matters for our decisions when we make AI agents. So suppose I'm building an AI agent, and all I need to do to get it going is I can like import one of two sets of weights. Again, I don't know anything about AI, so forget about the technological plausibility of this. But suppose there's some agent, okay, I can sort of activate it in two different ways. Call the agent if I activate it in the first way, primus, the second way, secundus or secundus. Suppose that there's going to be some significant psychological difference between them that's relevant to their welfare. So maybe primus would be an AI which is not conscious, and secundus would have states that would experience joy. Or maybe primus would have kind of altruistic psychology, and secundus would have like an egoistic psychology. And so that might affect how well off they are. If you're an impersonalist utilitarian, then it doesn't matter whether primus or secundus are the same person or different people. All that matters is which one would make the world go better. But for the personalist, it does matter. So suppose secundus would be happier. Then if they're the same person, then if we create primus, then there's something we could have done to make primus better off. We could have made them secundus. But if they're different people, then there's nothing I could have done to make primus better off. And so there's no case that I wrong them welfare-wise in the second situation, whereas in the first case, I might be wronging them. A way of putting this is that some acts of creation are what we might call flexible. So we could have created the same being in other ways. On the personalist view, when we create somebody using a flexible method, then even if their life is overall positive, the door is open for there being some moral objection to what we did. But if we create somebody via some kind of inflexible method, then there can't be any objection as long as their life is positive. Now, that suggests that we should be concerned about whether the way we are creating AI agents is flexible or not, which I think is a strange thing to be concerned about, but I think it seems to follow from personalism in the way I'm inclined to develop it. And unlike our creation of human beings, we have quite a bit of control over the ways we create AI. So what are the implications of that? I mean, practically speaking, it depends on, again, facts about personal identity and so forth. But if we want to create agents for some purpose besides promoting their own welfare, then it seems like we have a reason to create them using some inflexible method. Because if we could have created an agent in a way that was more suitable for its own welfare, then they might have an objection to us creating it some other way. And then just very briefly, it's worth noting that how flexible some act of creation is. It's partly a matter of the metaphysics of personal identity, but it's also partly a matter of contingent physical or technological limitations. So if it's a fact that I couldn't have created agent X in some other way, maybe that's because some of X's essential features are incompatible with it being that other way. But it could also just be like, I don't know a way to realize that feature on the hardware that X is running on, assuming that running on different hardware where it would suffice for being a different agent. So I don't know. Maybe if you don't want to fall short of your obligations to AI, you should run them on like the least powerful physical system that could support that, because then that makes it the least likely that you could have created them in a way that was better for them. again, don't take that too seriously, but hopefully the general theoretical ideas is clear. All right, that's I'm out of time, so I'll end it there. You can keep doing.